on time here. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us, or good day to you who are not in our time zone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Becca Clark, and I am the student recruiter for Thunderbird's online degree programs. A couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please enter those in the Q&A box at the bottom. We will answer, Dr. Cross will answer questions at the end of his presentation. I will be recording this and sending you a copy of the recording and the slides tomorrow or early next week. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Ted Cross, Clinical Assistant Professor of Leadership and our Academic Director for the Master of Applied Leadership and Management program at Thunderbird. Thank you, Dr. Cross.
Thank you, Becca, and welcome everyone today to this webinar on Winning Together, the Secrets of Negotiation. I thought this was a very appropriate topic in our webinar series on leadership and management practices. I remember a number of years ago, I was taking a negotiations class in graduate school, and it was actually one of my favorite classes I ever took. The first reason that I really loved the class is that we did lots of simulations. So we did a lot of mock negotiation practices with groups and with individuals and different scenarios. And I remember one time I was negotiating against a Wharton MBA student at the University of Pennsylvania. And as I was negotiating with this student, he was really beating me up badly in the negotiation process. I felt like I was really losing. I felt like that I wasn't doing a good job in the negotiation. He was really playing hardball and was pushing me on negotiating a better price. And I kind of left that negotiation simulation feeling pretty sad about myself. And then at the end of class, the professor pulled me to the side and said, "Did you see how hard that your opponent was negotiating against you and some of the tactics they were using?" And I said, "Yes." And my professor said, "That's how not to negotiate." And I was very interested in this because many times, at least in my mind, and I think in many people's mind, negotiation falls into this idea of winning versus losing, or a zero-sum game. In other words, in order to be a good negotiator, sometimes we believe that we have to take all and leave nothing for the opponent. Now, the other problem is we think of it in this adversarial nature of someone going against someone else and trying to win. Rather, today I'd like to talk a little bit more about how we can win together. And this isn't the idea of win-win, but this is the idea of how do we get more creative in our negotiations. And second, how do we understand the context within which we are negotiating, and also how can we understand some of the underlying principles of human behavior to help us frame our negotiation strategies. So today I'm going to go over a bunch of different background material. The first component that I really want to mention is this idea that we think often that data is the most important or most convincing part of negotiations. Now, the way I define negotiations is that negotiation is really just convincing someone or another entity to an agreeable position for both of you. We often might use data as our first sort of tool in our quiver of arrows, but we need to remember something about human nature. We all love data, but we often don't make decisions based on data, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Second, and this is a great book by Richard Schell, The Art of Woo, from the Wharton School of Business. And he mentions in his book, and we'll cover some of his principles, that we need to be other-oriented. As we approach our negotiations, we need to make sure that we are not being so self-centered that we don't hear the needs and concerns of others. And he mentions it here that we need to have an other-oriented perspective that focuses on the audience needs, perceptions, and feelings. We'll review that too. And last, this is one of the most famous negotiation books, Getting to Yes. And this book really covers a principle that I want to bring out at the end of the discussion, which is how do we be creative in our negotiation process and bring creativity rather than boxing ourselves into a quid pro quo type relationship with whoever we are negotiating with. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we can do some integrative bargaining and be more creative in our bargaining and negotiation process. Now, the question I always get whenever I'm teaching anything about influencing others, whether that's negotiation or the science of persuasive leadership, for example, is this ethical to learn these principles or these tactics and tools to be able to convince others or win at a negotiation or be more successful in getting a positive outcome in a negotiation situation? And what I like to point out to people is that we are all being influenced every second, whether or not we realize it. There was an interesting study done by Jonah Berger at the University of Pennsylvania, who was in a conversation with his father, actually, and his father said, "Hey, how come all lawyers in DC drive BMWs?" And Jonah said, "That's a great question." And he, being an academic, he decided to do a study on if that was A, true, and B, why would a certain group of people all drive similar types of vehicles? And what him and his colleagues did is they started studying neighborhoods where certain socioeconomic stratification lied. So many lawyers might live in a similar neighborhood, and many doctors might live in a similar neighborhood, and might have working professionals in a different type of neighborhood who are more white collar, and blue collar might have a different neighborhood. And so they started studying these neighborhoods and studying the cars that were in the driveways of the different houses. And what they found was, after looking at the data, that indeed people were more likely to purchase a car that appeared frequently in their own neighborhood. So if you had lots of SUVs or trucks, pickup trucks in your neighborhood, and you saw those every day, you are more likely to actually buy a pickup truck. Thus, to answer the question that Jonah's father had asked, which is, why do all the lawyers seem to have BMWs, including his father had one? And the answer was, because you've been exposed to seeing BMWs all the time in your neighborhood, and has influenced you without you even knowing it to make a purchase of that particular kind of car. Now, if we're being influenced at that invisible level, I think it's only rational and even more ethical to understand some of these principles behind human behavior that can help us be better negotiators and also be able to move towards more holistic approaches to reaching agreement with others. I'm going to kind of frame the discussion today within 4 different angles of negotiation. The first is prior beliefs. Second, we'll talk about emotions' role, agency, and incentives. And let me mention here that there's going to be, we're going to go through some different aspects that are about human behavior and sort of the social psychology of why we do things as humans and how we make decisions. And then at the end, I'm going to give you some concrete tactics that you can use to apply those principles. So prior beliefs, we often need to take into consideration when we're negotiating or speaking or trying to convince anyone else of something, that they bring their own prior beliefs and we bring our own prior beliefs also to the conversation. Now, this is important because humans tend to want to be consistent with their past behaviors and beliefs. So Richard Shell calls this a consistency trap. We can set a consistency trap for people. That's by asking them to do something that is in line with their current belief system, and then asking for something bigger down the road because it's in line with their belief system. But there's also can be a disconnect if we are asking someone to move their position that goes against their prior beliefs. So prior beliefs are important to understand, and as someone going into a negotiation situation, it is incumbent upon us to do our research on the person, on the organization, and on the situation. What kind of prior beliefs exist? It's not enough to just do a cursory glance through LinkedIn before you have a negotiation meeting. You need to understand what are the actual prior beliefs that that party is bringing to the negotiation table, and how you might understand those and not directly contradict them, because we will become defensive if we are if we feel like we're being attacked. A great example of this from my own life, I remember I grew up here in Arizona. I was fairly politically conservative. Then we moved to the East Coast, and I was around lots and lots of different types of people, and my beliefs started to change. But it was very hard for those beliefs to change because I had to negotiate the inconsistencies that I had previously in my life, and how I would negotiate that cognitive dissonance, that disconnect between what was and the new ideas that I was currently learning. Now, I also want to come back to the same example of my political beliefs and this idea of the boomerang effect. So here's a couple different things that we need to keep in mind as we are moving through prior beliefs. First is boomerang, and I'll talk about that in a second. And that's the notion that we're going to catalyze other people's belief bias. In other words, if someone already believes something from their prior experience, and we don't know what that is, and we walk into a situation and we really step in it, we will activate their belief bias, and they'll become very defensive. Back to that in 1 second. We also, even though we want to use data, we don't want to twist data to just match our own opinions, because people will begin to catch on to that, especially if they have prior beliefs that are different than the data that you're presenting. So let's be very honest in the presentation of the data. It is often helpful if you're trying to convince someone from one position to another through data, and the data is different than the data they might have in their prior belief system, to show them why the post or the previous data was wrong, or was only part of the picture, or how things have changed, and show why there is not really an incongruous gap between their prior belief in that data set and the new data set that you are presenting to them. And last, find common ground, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in relationships. But if you've done your homework and you're able to sort of understand the kinds of background that people have, you can start to build on common beliefs. My wife, Stephanie, is in real estate, and she is a really good negotiator, and she's also very good at building relationships quickly by finding common ground. She will find something that someone else is very interested in, that she has some interest in. It doesn't have to be a lot of interest, but something that she can talk about with them, and begin to talk with them about that and build a relationship quickly. Now, back to this boomerang effect. Sometimes we come full force at someone, and we don't know we're hitting on some prior beliefs, and it just makes them entrench further. Back to my example about my political beliefs, moving from Phoenix to Philadelphia and being conservative, and then learning more about more liberal types of ideologies. I actually, in Philadelphia, became even more conservative because I was resisting the different ideas that were the majority opinion around me. And as I was resisting those, I was trying to make sure that I was still congruent with my past beliefs, even though I thought that there was lots of good points being made around me, but I became more and more conservative. And later moved back to Phoenix. And when I moved back, I became a lot more liberal, because now I was surrounded by a bunch of conservative people. And what was happening there is that I was learning to negotiate my prior beliefs with new beliefs. And I was also, because I'm contrarian, going against the grain and trying to find ways to make sure that I was having a cohesive storyline of my own self. So we need to be careful and do our homework, make sure we understand the background of the party we're negotiating with, make sure we're not manipulating data, that we're being honest and presenting both sides of an issue, for example, or both sides of how a pricing scheme might be, or how a deal might be put together, and showing people transparently where we're coming from. And last, and most importantly, I believe, is make sure you find use the prior beliefs to find common ground with someone to build relationships. So this building relationships goes into this notion that Richard Shell talks about a lot in The Art of Woo, which is that relationships give people a level of trust and confidence. So we need to build on common ground, start to build a relationship, and that will often make it easier for us to negotiate a deal, to come to agreement on something. If you think about any time that you have bought a large purchase, you've probably found that you have asked your friends or people you trust to make a recommendation, and because someone made a recommendation and you trust them, you made the purchase. It's the same thing if we can have a relationship of trust with the parties that we are working with in a negotiation process, we're much more likely to be successful. Now, this does take time. Trust doesn't happen just overnight. And so, yes, there are some negotiations that are very transactional, but most of the time, negotiations involve a long-term relationship, whether that is negotiating your salary with your boss, whether that is even making a home purchase because you're going to have a relationship with your real estate agent for a long time, or even some of the other people involved at the bank. So you need to be careful of how we are treating these relationships as we are moving through this negotiation process. Now, the second thing I want to cover quickly is about emotion and how emotions play into the role of us making decisions and how we can use that in the negotiation framework. First thing I always like to get across to people is that we're not rational. We love data, but we don't often use data to make decisions. We use data to justify irrational decisions that we have made previously. So I often give the example that a number of years ago, I wanted to get a new television, and I wanted to get a new television because I saw one on sale that was really nice and big, and I thought that my television looked kind of junky in comparison. And so I did a bunch of research on Consumer Reports, and I asked my friends which TVs were the best, and I justified a purchase I really didn't need to make, but I really wanted to make, a new TV, new flat screen TV, through the data I had collected. Now, the reason I had collected all that data, if I really was honest with myself, is so that I could tell my friends and family when they asked me, why did you buy this TV? I could say, well, it has the best resolution and it was ranked the highest on Consumer Reports and it's not going to break and all these things. When in reality, those data points were just there to justify an emotional purchase. Now, the other thing about emotions is that they can be contagious. They've done a number of studies where they put people in the same room, one that is in one kind of mood, and then they rate and see if the other person's mood changes pre and post being in that room with the person with a certain type of emotion moving through the room. And it certainly does. We all know that we feel the emotions of others. We begin to sense that. That's just part of being human. And so as we are speaking with others, we can use emotion to be convincing. But how can we really do that? Well, one of the things we're going to talk about is how do you tell a good story to make sure that you're bringing forth the emotion into the negotiation process. I'm not saying to be corny in the negotiation process, but what I'm saying here is that we think that it's all about price and data and whatever other pieces are involved in negotiating a deal, when in reality, what we're really trying to do is convince the emotional person, the emotional self of that person, to agree with us. One interesting study I like to often cite about us not being rational and often being unconscious of this is a popcorn study that some scientists did a number of years ago. They made 2 batches of popcorn. One was very good tasting, buttered and salted and all that, and one was a bad tasting popcorn. It wouldn't hurt you or anything, but it just tasted really, really bad, and they put some stuff in there to make it taste horrible. And they sent a scientist to the movie theater, and they had people come and have some popcorn, and they gave them popcorn either in a large bucket or in a small bucket. And what they did first was they gave them the good tasting popcorn. Some people got it in a large bucket and some people got it in a small bucket. They weighed the popcorn before the moviegoers went to the movie. Then after they came out, they weighed the small buckets and the big buckets after they came out of the movie. And they found something very interesting, that on average, if people were given a large bucket, they were more likely to eat more popcorn, which makes no sense. The size of the container should not dictate how much popcorn people eat. But this was the case in condition 1. So they decided to do a second condition where they used the bad tasting popcorn to see if maybe it was just that, people disliked popcorn and it was a fluke. And so they put the bad tasting popcorn in big buckets and some in small buckets and gave it out to everyone, weighed it before and then weighed it after, and found the same thing. Even those people who were giving a big bucket of the bad tasting popcorn ate more of this bad tasting popcorn than those that had been given a small bucket of popcorn. And so the size of the container was influencing eating behavior, even though people didn't know it. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because the way that you package a deal to someone or a negotiation is very important, because there are subconscious triggers that you might actually be triggering. Now, one way to do that is through what I call framing. So how can we frame a situation in a way that focuses on what we want the party to focus on? I remember I was consulting for a law firm a while back, and they had a lawsuit they were working on. And one of the problems was that the opposition had a witness that was very compelling. It was an injury case. There was liability involved. And the main witness for the opposing side was very convincing. And what I suggested to this law firm was to go ahead and reframe the conversation, not to focus on this very compelling witness that the other side had, but the context within which this accident happened to this person, and how that by focusing on that context, you could show that actually this was an error, a user error, if you will, on the part of this very compelling hurt witness, right? They had gone into a dangerous area. We've refocused it and framed the conversation in that way, and that made all the difference in the outcome. So if we're not rational, then what do? Well, we need to, as leaders, as negotiators in these situations, paint a vision for people to understand where we're coming from, so they can see what we're trying to convince them of. And also, through painting a vision, we are activating the emotional side of our other party we're working with. Remember the BMW story, right? Where just mere exposure to the BMWs or the different types of cars in your neighborhood influence which ones you would buy. Another interesting story that I remember is, I mentioned that my wife Stephanie is in real estate, and I remember her negotiating one particular deal where she had a young family that wanted to buy this house that had multiple offers. So lots of people wanted to buy this particular house. Her clients really wanted it, but they didn't have the highest offer. They couldn't go in and give more money. There was actually other offers that were higher, and so she decided to use a different tactic. She decided to paint a vision. I remember listening to her talking to the other agent, and she would say things like, "This is a really cute family. They have 3 kids. They just moved here from Minnesota to get a new job, and they would really probably take care of this house, and I know that they really would enjoy it, and they'd be there for a long time." And she started describing this family and making the client human, rather than just being a paper offer. The family got the house, even though that they did not have the highest offer monetarily, but were able to activate, through painting a vivid picture, the emotions of the seller. One more thing I want to mention is agency or autonomy. And this is a simple concept, but it's important to remember inside of negotiation. The first is that people want control, right? Don't tell people what you're going to, get from them or how the deal is going to go. We need to help people feel like they are making the choices, and that they indeed are making some choices. Sometimes I call this, if you have children or nieces or nephews or young kids around and you're trying to get them to eat their vegetables, you can ask them, do you want to eat your peas or your carrots? You don't ask them, do you want to eat carrots or do you want to eat chocolate cake? You say, do you want to eat peas or carrots? So can we create a universe of choices that is acceptable to everyone and point people towards that? Second, we got to ask more questions than we actually speak. So I struggle with this. I like to talk a lot, but if we can listen in the negotiation process, it'll help us find out the needs, desires, and prior beliefs of others and make us more effective. Last is we need to really, really control ourselves to not override our instinct to control. So we all want to, especially when stakes are high, when we're in a negotiation situation, we want to control a situation. But the more we try to control, oftentimes the other person on the other side of the table feels more boxed in and can become more defensive. So we need to make it a more collaborative type of a conversation. This is just an example of a study that they did a number of years ago on sort of what's the difference between just being purely incentive driven versus helping people to be more creative in their problem solving. And what I'm arguing is that we need to be more creative. And in this instance, this is called the candlestick problem. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see these experimenters gave a bunch of different people a book of matches, a candle, and a box of tacks. And they said, your task is to make sure that the candle gets stuck to the wall somehow and that you can, turn on the candle by lighting it on fire, right? And so people tried all kinds of different things. They tried to light matches and melt the side of the candle and stick it to the wall, and that didn't really work. And they couldn't figure it out. Of course, the answer is there on the right-hand side, which is you take the tacks out of the box, pin the box to the wall, put the candle in the box, and then light the candle. But we don't think of the box as part of the solution. We think of it as something that brings the tacks. And this is a problem of what social psychologists and scientists call functional fixedness. We often don't see that one thing in the universe of a solution can really help us. We think of it as just, a box of tacks. Now, another interesting thing about this problem is that one group of people, they said, hey, we're going to time you to solve this problem. And the faster you do it, the more money we'll give you. Then they gave another group and they said, we're still going to time you, but we're just timing you just to take the average. And however long it takes you to solve the problem is however long it takes you. Now, when they looked at the average times to sort of solve this problem, what they found was the ones that had monetary incentives attached, in other words, the faster they solve the problem, the more money they make, took 3.5 times longer to solve the problem than the ones that were just told, solve this problem. And part of that is because when we introduce very concrete incentives into situations that are complex, it shuts down the creative part of our brains and we get very focused on solving the problem. And we might not be able to see that the answer is that the box of tacks is not just a box of tacks. Now, this is very important in negotiations because if we don't understand, if we are just thinking of it from a purely incentive-driven process, that is, we're going to negotiate price, we're going to negotiate terms, we're going to negotiate terms of payment, etc. The problem is that we might miss the creative ways that we could come to an even better solution. Now, one last thing I'll mention here is that we often want to make sure that we are asking people to use habits that they already have rather than creating new habits. Sometimes when we're negotiating, the problem really isn't the price. The problem is that we're asking people to change their behaviors, and that can be very hard. Let me give you an example. Recently, I was watching a pitch competition on TV where people pitch their inventive ideas to a bunch of investors. And this particular inventor came in front of these investors and said, look, I have a solution for a problem. And they said, what's the problem? They said, well, lots of people now order deliveries from Amazon online, from Walmart online, from different online retailers, and they have these packages delivered to their homes. But the problem is that now there's a new crime wave sweeping, at least here in the US for certain, where people are stealing those packages off the front porch. And so this inventor said, I have a solution. The solution is this box, and he presented this very nice box that you would put on your front porch, and he said it has a smart lock. And a smart lock is very interesting because what it has is a special numeric key that when the mail carrier or the UPS man or the Amazon delivery person comes, they can come to this box with a lock on their front porch, open it with a unique ID, put the package in the box, close it back up and lock it, and it would be secure and solve the problem of ever having people steal your boxes off your front porch. Now, I was really interested in this pitch because the technology was amazing. The technology really was in the lock. It had this interesting sort of blockchain technology to unlock the lock. But what the investor said is, we're not going to invest in your venture. And when this inventor asked why, they said, because you're asking too many human behaviors to change. You need to purchase the box and put it onto your porch. Second, you're asking the mail carrier or the delivery person of any kind to know how and learn how to use this new kind of lock and recognize that you have this box on your front porch to begin with. Now, this is too many behaviors for people to change. And so he was denied his deal. He didn't get his funding. His negotiation was a failure. On the other hand, there was another inventor, and you guys probably seen ads for this. They invented a doorbell that has an actual camera inside of it. And originally, the doorbell was just made to sort of see who was at the door through a video camera. But what they found and quickly pivoted was that this was the solution to the stealing the boxes off your front porch problem. If people knew that someone had a camera on their front porch, they were less likely to steal the packages. The interesting thing about this solution is it didn't require anyone to change any habits. The delivery person just put the package on the front step. People already had doorbells. All they had to do was switch it out. So it wasn't a new sort of box they had to put out or learn how to use a lock. It was just a doorbell with a button, and it hooked into their existing computer system through their Wi-Fi. And so this was a solution that used an existing habit of how people already operated and found a solution to the problem. That's what we have to do in negotiations. We've got to be careful that we're not asking people to change lots and lots of behaviors. Many of you have seen this. You've negotiated a great deal, and for some reason it falls apart at the end because of behavioral concerns, or because someone says, yes, we would love to buy this software, for example, but nobody's going to use it at our place of work, and so we're not going to go through with the deal. So we need to make sure we are tapping into existing habits. Another thing to do is to ask for small behaviors before big ones. I call this the puppy dog syndrome. You go to the pet store and you look at the cute puppy, right? Then a store person comes by and says, hey, do you want to pet that cute puppy? And you say, sure, and you pet the cute puppy. And then they say, I come back a little bit later, say, would you like to hold the puppy and play with the puppy? And you say, okay, I'll play with the puppy. And then at that point, you have the puppy and you already probably have 3 names picked out for it. And they ask you, would you like to buy the puppy? And you say yes. Now, if they just would have started at the beginning, asked you to buy the puppy, you would have said no, but they asked for small behaviors in line with the bigger ask that they were going to make. This is often called the foot in the door technique, right, in sales, but it also applies to negotiations. Are there benchmarks we can set? Are there small contingencies that we can set inside of a contract, for example? Are there ways that we can build relationships over time to ask for small behaviors that lead to larger ones? Smaller asks to bigger asks. Last is incentives. We've talked a lot about how rewards and incentives can be useful, but we got to make sure we're considering the human element. So I want to go through a few tactics. The first is, before you go into a negotiation, yes, price is important. So you've done your prior belief analysis and research, you've built a relationship of trust, you have a relationship with the person or persons you're negotiating with, you figured out sort of what their true desires are, and you've decided that you're going to enter into a true negotiation of price, for example. The first thing you need to make sure is, what is your target price, if we're talking about price? And then what is your zone of possible agreement, or ZOPA, right? The zone of possible agreement is what is the range within which you would make a deal. So you need to set some parameters for yourself, which is first, what is your target price or your target negotiation agreement that you want? And what is the range of possibilities of price, for example, from low to high, within which that band you would be acceptable, and outside of that, which is not acceptable. Now, this can help us not get overly emotional ourselves when we're into the negotiation process, because we have set backstops of, oh, I can't take less than X, and if I got more than Y, that's great, but somewhere in between would be just fine. Second, and this is from Getting TS, we need to separate the people from the problem we're trying to solve, or the contract we're trying to negotiate, or the sale we're trying to make. Usually when we're negotiating, we're trying to solve a problem and come to agreement. And so we need to make sure that we are not looking at the people as the owner of the problem or the owner of the price. Rather, we separate the problem from the people, and we look at the problem together and try to solve it collaboratively. One great example of a tactic that Yuri talks about in this book is that sometimes when you're negotiating, it's not useful to sit across the table from each other. It's often important to sit next to the people, literally, and put a presentation in front of you that centers on the problem you are both trying to solve through the negotiation process. This creates the ability to not go against each other, but rather to be able to look at the problem objective and separate the people from the problem. Second, focus on interest, not position. So that means we're not just thinking about price or features or terms, but rather what are the people, what's their position, and why are they holding that position? How can we let them keep that integrity of position without sacrificing it and still come to agreement? Invent options for mutual gain. We'll talk about that in a minute, but that's the idea of integrative bargaining. How can we be more creative? And then also insist on using objective criteria that everyone can agree on. Let me give you a perfect example. Let's say that you're offered a new job in a new town. If you don't know the cost of living difference between your current living situation and the new city, you won't be able to use any objective criteria to negotiate a salary, for example. So you need to make sure in the process that you are all in agreement, both parties, that you're using an objective criteria that everyone can agree on. And then last, know your BATNA. Now, BATNA stands for Best Alternative to Negotiated Agreement. So yes, you need to know your target price, you need to know your zone of possible agreement, and you need to know what happens if I can't reach a deal. What's my best alternative to this negotiated agreement? The more alternatives you have, the less flexible you have to be in the negotiation. If you don't have very many different alternatives, then you need to be more flexible. But you need to know your alternatives to the negotiated agreement before you get into a negotiation. We already talked about BATNA, so I'll skip that. One last thing is anchoring, and this is often happens when we start negotiating price. And this is the idea that whatever number is thrown out first, it's very, very often that the price will be similar or in the range of that initial anchored price, because as we throw out the initial price, it anchors people into a certain mindset. They've even done studies where they had a bunch of students come in to do a number of ratings on surveys, and they had them walk past pictures that had large numbers and stuff like that, and then they would come into this place to do an experiment and rate different things. And if they had walked by larger numbers that were on the walls hidden in different paintings and whatnot, they would actually rate higher. And then they did other studies where they did negotiations, and if people had walked by or heard larger numbers before even getting into the mock negotiation, they were likely to settle at higher prices. And that's just because subconsciously you're seeing these numbers and you're not noticing it, but it's influencing you in this. And so anchoring is an important factor to keep in mind. that we will be influenced by the initial conversations of pricing. This last part is what I think is the most interesting and important, and that's how do we be creative through the integrative bargaining process. Let me give you an example. Someone was asking me how to negotiate their salary with their boss the other day, and they were really hung up on the salary price, which is important. And I said, what about other things? And they said, what do you mean other things? I said, what about asking for more vacation days? And they said, oh, I hadn't thought of that. I said, what about asking for a yearly bonus? Or what about asking for a bonus after you reach certain goals or a salary increase? And so are there other ways that we can get more creative and collaborative and actually bringing in other things into the bargaining process, into the negotiation process that aren't necessarily price sensitive, but could be beneficial and make the deal better? For example, is it okay would you be willing to accept a deal on a car, for example, if they're willing to throw in the monthly maintenance? Because maybe the salesperson has to keep a certain price for their boss, but they're able to give you the monthly maintenance for free for a year, right? Is there a way, if you're buying a house, that you can get some of the furniture that you want in there rather than getting them to come down on price? There's lots of different things that we can throw into the mix, and this is called integrative bargaining, that can make things a lot better. Oftentimes, I've been in situations as a leader and manager where I would like to hire a new employee, or I would like to retain an employee who has had another offer. And the negotiation process begins. We talk about salary. I'm not able to meet their salary demands, but I'm able to retain or to win over that recruit because I offer flexibility of schedule. So they can work from home a couple days a week, or they might be able to come and go to work at odd hours to beat traffic, right? Those kinds of things can make a big difference. Even though we don't quantify them particularly in the negotiation process, they can make the deal happen. It can help us to be much more creative. Here's our reading list for today. The Art of Woo, I do recommend, from Richard Schell. Influencing Mind is another one. Getting to Yes is a perennial favorite. And then at the bottom is a bunch of background reading you might want to use that will help you understand the context of how people make decisions from the behavioral economics and behavioral science point of views. Now, remember, as you are moving into your negotiations, that negotiations happen not just in the boardroom, but also in all aspects of your life. And so this is a way to start thinking about how do you sell your ideas, how do you sell yourself, and how do you use strategies that are effective and tactics that can help you be more creative in problem solving. We'll send this out. These are additional readings you might want to look at. And thank you so much for joining us. If you like these kinds of topics, we'd encourage you to reach out to us here at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And in particular, we'd love to see you apply for our Master of Applied Leadership and Management program. I'll now turn the time over to Becca and for any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Cross. We have some questions. From Zahir. He finds it interesting that you did not mention Cialdini's book on persuasion in the first few slides. Is that because it's more of a marketing sales perspective versus negotiation?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Zahir finds it interesting that you did not mention Cialdini's book on persuasion.
Yes, okay. Yeah, so we didn't talk about Cialdini's principles of persuasion, though some of them are embedded in some of the background that we talked about of understanding how humans make decisions and how those social psychology effects happen. The reason I didn't bring that in is because I was trying to focus more on negotiations today rather than the sales, but really they're one and the same, right? Negotiations is sales, whether or not we want to think it is or not. It's just that oftentimes what we need to think about through negotiations is how do we be more creative in the integrative bargaining.
Also a comment from Zahir. This is really great stuff. This is why he watches every single seminar you do. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to have you, Zahir. Thanks for coming. Please tell your friends. We're glad to continue to have these once a month.
A question from Ambrose, are there postgraduate scholarships at Arizona State?
There are, and Becca would be a good person to contact for that. We have some special scholarships, especially for some of our international students, and there's other opportunities available. Becca would be a great contact to walk you through that.
Okay, also just a note to James is that my mic is echoing
Got it.
very terribly. So if you'd fix that, that would be great. Okay, question from Keegan. When two people who are already have a working relationship with two differing value systems are debating on a course of action, what would be the best way to secure a successful agreement?
This is a really tough question. Sometimes we can't come to agreement, so that's what's great about the ZOPA, the zone of possible agreement. So what's the universe that you have first coming into the negotiation process, things that are acceptable. Second, I think it is important if you have opposing ideological prior beliefs or there's different viewpoints of a particular problem, is there a way to sort of go examine a third solution or a third way that is often described in the negotiations literature, which would not offend either sensibility. So don't have one worldview prevail over the other or one school of thought prevail over the other, but find a third school of thought or prior belief system that could be acceptable to both parties. That way it's not a dialectic relationship. It's not one against the other. It's problem-centric, and then using a third way to solve that problem, which isn't owned or internalized by either party.
From Zahir, what if people do not want to use objective criteria because they know that it will put them at a disadvantage? How do you build agreement on criteria?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you build agreement on criteria, of objective criteria? It's often useful, and this goes back to another question we had earlier, to use one of Cialdini's principles of influence, which is authority. So can you, for example, point to an authoritative measure within the industry that you are trying to negotiate that is objective enough that most everyone agrees on it? So for example, in international management and leadership, we often use data from the World Bank as a sort of agreed upon, third-party, reliable sort of measure. And then we can measure successes or negotiate or debate different topics based on that objective criteria. So it's often helpful to have a solution that is authority driven, that is from some outside authority. It's also useful to ask the other party which third party authorities or objective criteria they would suggest, so you can see where they're coming from and then move towards negotiating criteria from there. Now, I certainly understand that it is almost a separate negotiation to agree on the criteria, and that can be tough, but it's important to sort of nail down before you move on in a larger negotiation. If it's a smaller negotiation or you're really flexible in your integrative bargaining techniques, maybe the criteria isn't as important. So maybe it's not just dollar amount, but it's rather dollar amount plus all these intangibles that would make it an agreeable situation. Then maybe some of the measures aren't as important, but in other situations they're very important to get nailed down.
Question from D. How do you get a prospective client's beliefs if you have never met with them before your presentation meeting?
That's a great question. So the first thing that I would say is that, is there a way to meet with that person before you have a client presentation? Is there a conversation, an informal conversation or an informal way to interact with that person to start building a true relationship? This is why oftentimes in the business world we separate business development from sales, because development requires building long-term relationships and sales often requires the ability to close the deal in a very short amount of time. Oftentimes we have to be one and the same. We're the salesperson and the business development person. And we forget about the business development. So we're going in pretty cold. We're trying to make an ask without having had an introduction or actually a conversation with people. That's another way to help warm the situation. If you can't meet with a particular person you're going to pitch to, is there someone else in the organization that you can meet with, get to know what they think, other people you can meet with? Can they introduce you to the stakeholder, the decision maker before you make your pitch? But there has to be, if possible, some sort of relationship building that will help you gather intelligence before you get into that pitch. If not, you're going to have to gauge it during the presentation, which is a whole different type of skill, right? And part of that might be leading the conversation with open-ended questions to find out what they believe as a client, what they want as a client, and have several different pitches ready depending on what sort of tact they bring out at the beginning of the meeting.
A question from Ambrose. What superior options do young people need to use to win a case in point, mostly while addressing their superiors and their innovations are always rubbished?
Yeah, this is a great question. Oftentimes, if you're a younger person in the workplace, people think that you don't have enough experience to really make a difference or to propose something new and innovative or something that would really work. Sometimes what you can do is if you're really focused on solving the problem rather than being right and getting credit, you will be able to have success. What do I mean by that? If you are trying to sell your idea as your idea, and it's Ted's idea, for example, and they think I'm too young, then they're not going to want to accept my solution. If I can pitch my idea as a soft sell to my superiors and help it become their idea and reframe it as their idea and how they have come up with a great idea. So I've done this many times with bosses before. I have an idea I want to come through to help solve the problem. They don't want to listen to it from me. So I've asked them questions, my superiors that is, and helped lead them towards a similar kind of answer as what I had, and then reinforced as they were getting closer to the answer that I wanted by giving them praise and smart they were for clients. Now, this is a skill. It takes some skill, but if you can help your superiors get the credit for coming up with the idea or a variation of your idea, and you're not beholden to taking credit, you'll be able to actually get it implemented over time.
A question from Heba. What about your leadership expectation regarding winning the negotiation?
Yeah, that's a great question. You'll want to have a conversation with your leadership before you get into the negotiation of what is that zone of possible agreement. So they'll probably give you some price. If you can bend on the price some, then ask what other types of features they might want. Another thing to do is if you are using integrative bargaining and you are bringing in intangible sort of variables into the equation where, for example, you didn't get the price you wanted on the software, but instead you did get a decent price on the software plus free maintenance to the software and IT help for the first 6 months. You need to quantify that free service you got added in, and then bring that back to your leadership to show them overall the deal was within the value that you wanted to get. It just came in different segments rather than just on price.
From Ahmed, what do you do if the other side disagrees just to prevent winning?
It's a great question. Sometimes sometimes we won't reach agreement, and that's part of understanding negotiations, is that sometimes you have to walk away from the negotiations table and realize that this person isn't interested in coming up with an agreement, and take your idea, your business to other places. Now, if that's not an option, you need to figure this out, then it might require building a further relationship with that person and backing off on pushing your idea or your position. And as you build a relationship, then reselling later, renegotiating at a later date.
From David, what if during the negotiation process, one or both parties have lost a level of trust? What tools do you use to help overcome the trust breakdown and get negotiations back on track?
That's a great question because this happens all the time. Mistakes are made, or someone else enters the negotiation process that has ulterior motives and trust is lost. I think one of the first things we can do is, if we have built a relationship with people, try to have some informal meetings and express, be honest that some things haven't gone well, and that you've owned that, whatever your portion is. That might allow them to also own any portion of the breakdown in trust that they have. But if we try to pretend that it didn't have anything to do with our side and it was all on their side, they're very unlikely to become vulnerable and to express that they had a part in the breakdown of trust. So we need to first express that some of the things some of the mistakes we might have made. Of course, be careful. You're consulting with your legal team, the kinds of things that you can talk about there. But make sure that we are actually showing that we understand that this is a relationship, that there's been some mistakes made, and then if they can start to come around, you can rebuild trust that way.
Our last question comes from Kenneth. Any tips for cross-cultural negotiation?
This is a very important question. We have a number of professors who specialize in this here at Thunderbird. One of the things first to understand is, what type of culture are you going? Are you moving into a different culture? So you need to have some background on that culture and understand how things are done. Is there a power and distance variables that you need to understand there? Are there different customs that you might need to understand? So it requires a further level of research in the prior belief category. So what are the prior beliefs culturally that may influence this negotiation, and what might I need to know before I go into that negotiation? It's often important to employ a consultant or someone who has lived in that country or region and ask lots and lots of questions and do some role plays before you get into the actual situation, so that you can practice being sensitive to other cultures. Actually,
Thank you for joining us, everyone, and we hope to see you next month on December 13th.
thank you, everyone.